Hi there, thank you for watching this webinar. This webinar is on human rights and equalities and funding applications. My name is Suki, I am Policy and Engagement Lead for THRE, and together with my colleague Alice, we're going to be talking about funding applications and really those tricky questions around human rights and equalities. We know that increasingly lots of funders in the sector are looking for information on how applicants are building human rights and equalities into their work and the projects that they're delivering in communities. We also know that this has raised some questions with folks maybe being a bit unsure about how to talk about the work that you do in terms of human rights and equalities. So we hope with this webinar that we can address those questions and provide you with some information and knowledge that can give you some confidence in going into those processes and talking about the work that you do. So we're just going to introduce a little bit about ourselves before we get started. So we are THRE. THRE stands for Third Sector Human Rights and Equalities. We are a project that works across Scotland, led by GCVS in Glasgow in partnership with Highland TSI up in Highlands and EVOC over in Edinburgh. We work with Scotland's third sector interfaces and we are responsible for delivering resources, training and networks to support third sector organisations, much like yourselves, with taking that human rights and equalities first approach to your organisational development and delivery. So that's us. And over the course of this webinar, we're going to go through a few things. We're going to start with human rights. What are they? Why are they important? Go a bit into equalities, understanding what they are and what they can really mean in practice. And then taking all of this information into a bit more of a practical direction by talking about the panel principles and what you can do with those in terms of talking about your organisation and how you can translate that into something meaningful for funding applications. Got a little bit of a workshop activity, which, given that this is a offline webinar, you're probably gonna need some pens and some paper to do. But hopefully that reflection will get you to think about your work that your organisation does and be able to start putting that language into your funding applications to hopefully get some results. So that's really the roadmap for this webinar today. And without further ado, we'll get right into it and I'll pass you over to Alice to start talking about human rights and equalities.
So to start us off today, I want to take a second just to break down those terms of human rights and equalities so that we're all on the same page of what we mean by those terms before we get into the detail about how they can be applied to our work. So I'm going to start off just by explaining what human rights are. So human rights are rights that are inherent to everyone, regardless of their identity or their background. They provide a minimum standard for how we should all be treated, and they're rooted in the recognition that we all share a common fundamental humanity. That means that we have them simply because we are human. They're universal, meaning that we all have rights regardless of our background, our identity, or anything else. And they are inalienable, meaning that we can't take them away from anyone. And they're also indivisible, so all of our rights have the same level of importance and should be treated as such. Some rights you may be familiar with already, and there are others that might be new to you. So ones like right to life, you might have heard of already, for example. And I'm actually not going to dwell on those too much for the purpose of today, because we're not focusing on being legal experts. We just want to instead emphasize the values that underpin human rights and equalities and how those can support our work. So I think they're much more helpful for our everyday work in the sector. So moving on to the next slide now, I'm going to show you what those values are. So human rights are built upon a set of principles represented by the acronym of THRE. And THRE stands for fairness, respect, equality, dignity, and autonomy. And those principles underpin lots of human rights legislation documents. If you were to get up a PDF of the Declaration of Human Rights right now, on literally the first page, you'll see dignity, because it is the foundation of human rights. And these values are really useful to us when we're thinking about human rights and equalities every day, because they're really easily understandable. I think everyone, regardless of their background, the culture, their language, can all agree that we should be treating people with fairness and respect, etc. And we can all really understand what it looks like every day, even if we can't neatly give a definition for these terms. As Dr. Elaine Webster, who is a researcher at the University of Strathclyde, says about dignity, we know it when we see it. And because of that, these values are really great tools for embodying human rights and equalities first approach without necessarily needing to get stuck into like the legal bits that we usually associate with human rights. So just moving us on, now that we've covered human rights, I'm going to talk about equalities. And this may feel strange that equalities was one of those freedom principles I just mentioned, but we're also talking about equalities on its own. And the reason that we split equalities out from those other freedom principles and talk about it as its own thing, separate and with human rights, is because equalities are a really powerful tool for identifying the barriers that different groups of individuals have to accessing their rights, and also helps to address them. So they are vital for the fulfillment of our human rights. And as you can see from the slide, they're about ensuring that every individual has an equal opportunity to make the most of their lives and their talents. And the right to equality and freedom from discrimination are enshrined in human rights treaties. And that means that human rights and equalities come hand in hand. Now, one way in which you may be familiar with equalities already is the Equality Act. The Equality Act is a key piece of legislation in the UK that is our main kind of equalities guidance. And what the Equality Act does is it sets out 9 protected characteristics, and it is unlawful to discriminate against anyone based on those 9 protected characteristics. So those are age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, pregnancy and maternity, race, religion or belief, sex, and sexual orientation. And what you may notice from this list is that there are some characteristics that feel quite relevant to how you deliver your services, how you act as an organization, what you do, that aren't on this list. So for example, you might find that actually something that really impacts on people's ability to access services and be a part of their local community is socioeconomic status and poverty. And so that may be something that you want to be thinking about in addition to the protected characteristics. Maybe you work with young people and you have seen how being a care experienced really affects young people's outcomes. So you may want to have specific policies around that, or expand your EDI policies beyond just referencing the protected characteristics so that you're including those other groups that aren't within the Equality Act that you know are relevant to be thinking about for your organization. And I'm going to hand over to Suki again now, just to explain a little bit about the phenomenons in society that kind of underpin why it's so important that we are thinking about equalities day to day. So I'll just hand over to her now.
Thank you, Alice. So now we are going to go on to a concept called the dominant identity. And the reason why we're taking a bit of time to go into the dominant identity is because I think sometimes we can approach the term equalities as a bit of a monolith, just as a thing without really examining what it means, what it looks like, and why equality is such an important concept in the first place. So that's why we're going to take a bit of a step back and think about the dominant identity. So what does that mean? Well, the dominant identity comes in 2 parts. So dominant meaning more power and more influence, and identity meaning a characteristic like a gender or a nationality, or in many instances a combination of some characteristics. And the dominant identity is really a description of a pattern that is observable in society, in organizations, even in small teams. It's something that physically shapes the world in terms of the way that we design buildings and equipment, but also something that shapes culture, expectations, policy, and laws. And so we've got this phrase that the dominant identity shapes the world, and that's really trying to summarize that really stubborn pattern that underlies much of the inequality in society and what creates a lot of these barriers that we talk about. An instance of dominant identity can be really, it can be just the most common identities amongst those who hold power. So, for example, MPs or CEOs tend to be of similar identities, or it could just be that is what is most frequent, numerous, or normalized in society as a whole. So, for example, wheelchair users versus non-wheelchair users, there are more people that aren't using wheelchairs than there are people in wheelchairs, and so that's the dominant identity in that instance. And decision makers tend to cater towards the identity that's most normalized in society as a whole, or the ones that they hold themselves. So these decisions can often intentionally or unintentionally have really stark negative impacts on people that sit outside of those groups. So for example, this image that we've got on screen here, these are crash test dummies, car crash test dummies, and these are used by car manufacturers to test how safe new car models are, whether or not they're going to seriously injure the folks that are inside the cars based on the way that they've designed them if they're involved in a crash. And this image here is really representing something that has been apparent in design over the last few decades, and that up until fairly recently, the average crash test dummy was only ever modelled after the average male proportion. And so people that sat outside of that group, which tended to be women, actually weren't really considered in these car crash tests and designs. And the impact of that actually is that women are 47% more likely to be seriously injured in a car crash, and also 17% more likely to die. And that's because they don't fit within the box that was kind of used to test these vehicles. And you can see that in lots of other aspects of design and other kind of industries. So for example, police stab-proof vests and body armor is often also designed for the average or stereotypical male body. And again, people that don't fit within that box often found that they have a lot of issues in using it. So there was a story just a few years ago about a female police officer who died after taking her body armor off because she had to use a big red key, a big battering ram, to try and enter a premises in which there was someone inside that was being kind of chased. And so she actually couldn't use that equipment while she was wearing her body armor, and upon taking it off and getting into the premises, she was stabbed and immediately killed. And that was a direct impact about that body armor not being designed for her or people with her bodily proportions. And we can also see this in other aspects of health. So for example, the way that we think about heart attacks tends to be the stereotypical way that men tend to have heart attacks. So this will be the kind of grabbing your chest, having real problems kind of with breathing, grabbing the left arm. That's kind of what's been taught as typical and what to look out for. However, lots of medical data will support the fact that actually women tend to have different symptoms when they have are experiencing heart attacks. So that might present as lower back problems, lower back pain, something that feels a bit more like heartburn, even pain in the jaw. That can be what is more typical actually for people experiencing heart attacks that are women. And as a result of this, even the tests conducted in hospitals and treatment provided have been found to have poorer outcomes for women. So a statistic finds that women in the UK actually have more than double the rate of death in the 30 days following a heart attack than men. And we can see this in lots of different places, even in safety equipment for firefighters, with anecdotally female firefighters having to buy their own safety equipment because the standard sizes don't fit as they're supposed to based on typically male proportions. And it's not just in terms of gender, in terms of body shapes and sizes. We can see this as well across race as well. So I've got a video here. Let me just check if I'm sharing my sound. And so pardon me, I got a little bit too early. This is a hand soap dispenser, automatic hand soap dispenser. I think most people have came across these in public bathrooms and other places. And what it's supposed to do is you pop your hand under it and soap comes out. But this doesn't work as it should do for lots of people. And so I'll play the video and I'll just narrate it a little tiny bit. So it starts off with a person. That is how the machine should work. And now an individual with darker skin. The audio he's saying too black. Too black. Absolutely no luck in getting soap out of this machine. So what he does is very, very, very light, very, very white as well, and the napkin has absolutely no problem in getting soap out of the soap dispenser. And this is because these machines, they use optic lasers in order to detect whether or not something is underneath it. And these machines just don't work very well with dark skin tones. And for something that is for use in a public space, that will likely be used by lots of people with darker skin tones, this is really kind of a big oversight, I would say, in terms of these design teams and how they've really excluded quite a large percentage of the population from being able to use or access soap in a public space because of the way that these machines are designed. And we can see this, I guess, across other aspects of technology. So this image here is of protests outside of the Uber headquarters. So this was around, I think around the time of kind of the early stages of the pandemic and lockdown. And so Uber introduced a new system on their app. So Uber is a kind of taxi ride-sharing app. And the drivers that were working, they had to use a new system in order to actually log on to the app and start working and access their accounts. However, it was found that the new system was quite biased, and actually it did not recognize, in terms of facial recognition, it did not recognize those with darker skin, so with black and brown skin, and would actually lock out and terminate drivers who are unable to log in after repeated attempts. And so this is, again, an example of tech that was not designed with people with darker skin in mind. And so if you see the placard on the right-hand side that said "Stop Unfair Terminations," if you weren't able to get into your app after a certain number of repeated attempts, it would actually terminate your account and essentially fire you. And again, this was during really the early stages of the pandemic, in which job security was, you know, a huge concern, and so predominantly drivers of ethnic minority background were the ones that were impacted by this. And last example, this one here is just a cartoon graphic of pulse oximeters, and these are devices that read people's blood oxygen levels. You pop them on the end of your finger, and they can tell you how much or what percentage your blood oxygen levels are at. And this was, of course, and still is, a really key medical device in the context of COVID, because back when folks weren't really that sure about symptoms and how to kind of distinguish between who was really seriously ill and who was maybe just in need of some kind of like light treatment. When paramedics were prioritising who needed to be admitted to the hospital to receive more urgent care, they'd be able to use these pulse oximeters to look at someone's blood oxygen levels and actually be able to tell how ill someone was. However, again, these devices use optical lasers similar to the ones in the hand soap dispenser video, and often struggle to read people with darker skin, often actually reading them as having higher levels of oxygen in their blood than they actually did. And you might have heard the statistic that BAME people died at much higher numbers of COVID-19 during the pandemic, and this likely would have been one of the contributors. Now, looking across all of these examples, the design of these machines, all of these pieces of technology, I highly doubt that they were done in malice. I highly doubt that anyone was setting out to make life harder for people of colour. However, as a result of the dominant identity, as a result of these product teams maybe being predominantly made up of people with lighter skin, that has led to real life and sometimes fatal effects for those who don't belong to that dominant identity group. And taking it into yet another kind of group, what has been established as the standard by the dominant identity group isn't always better for the majority of the world. I think often an argument against making things more accessible, making things more inclusive is that's just the way it is. It's just like that's how it's always been, or you know, it's easier just to keep things as they are. But I just want to take a moment just to kind of unpack that and think about how actually that's not really the case in a lot of instances. What has been established as the standard isn't always better for the majority of the world. So changing these norms to accommodate for non-dominant groups often benefits more people than we may initially think. So in this example, we've got a person in a wheelchair who is looking at a train. There's quite a big gap between the platform and the train, and they're thinking, how on earth am I going to get on that without some sort of assistance, some sort of ramp, some sort of help? And in this example, step-free access, having step-free access from platform to train would be, of course, really, really helpful for this person in helping them get around, be able to access services, be able to go out and have a engagement with the community. And that's not really something that's only just for wheelchair users. Actually, having step-free access, having places that are more accessible for wheelchairs isn't just going to be good for wheelchair users. We can think about how that's going to benefit parents with buggies, with children in prams and pushchairs, people with lower mobility, older people with shopping trolleys, small children, even just people who are of lower mobility or have shorter legs. All of these groups would benefit from ramps and that same level access for mobility. And so, when we're thinking about the changes that can be made in terms of equality, it's not just always about that one group. Obviously, it really is, but equality for some often leads to equality for all in terms of it really having impacts across the board. Another example that has came to mind for me is in terms of feminist city planning. You might have heard of this, you might not have. I think it was just a couple of years back, Holly Bruce, Glasgow City Council, she introduced a motion for feminist city planning in Glasgow. And there was some discussion about that in terms of like, well, it's not just women that live in the city. Why should we be a feminist city? But really, feminist city planning isn't just about women. It's not just for women. It benefits really a lot of people and a lot of people that aren't women in terms of thinking about public safety, thinking about the way that we design our public spaces in terms of making them safer, more accessible, and also more inclusive for women. That benefits lots of people in terms of those who are just visibly a bit different. There's lots of people who feel unsafe walking alone at night or are actually at higher risk of being attacked. That can be trans people, that can be children and young people. Those of any sort of visible difference would also benefit from those principles that are introduced under feminist city planning. So really it's just to say that, we can often have these thoughts that like equality is something that's difficult, something that is above and beyond, and something that is an additional nice thing to do. But actually, equality is something that impacts everyone, and it's not just about sort of the obvious groups in a sense. And so thinking about how we can thinking about how we can expand our definitions of equality to go beyond what's just on the textbook. So like Alice was referring to earlier in terms of the protected characteristics, it's not just about those groups that sit within that protected characteristics category. Of course, that's really important, but that has ramifications that goes far beyond just the groups that we think about in the Equality Act. And often all of these groups interlink with each other and have lots of crossover. And so it's not just about kind of the neat boxes and checking them off, but it's a much bigger thing than that. So that is just really trying to unpack that definition that we hold of equality and thinking beyond just that sort of tick boxy EDI way of looking at equality and thinking about how it's much bigger than that and actually has a lot of impact for the communities and people that we support. So that was about equality, and we're going to kind of take all of these principles because you're probably thinking, right, that's really great, but what do I do with all of that? And we're going to answer that question by introducing something called the panel principles. And the panel principles, they're kind of the how when it comes to human rights and equalities. So we've covered the what are human rights, what are equalities, but what do we do with that? And in this section, we're going to look at the how. How do you do that? And one way of doing that is by using the panel principles. So there's many different ways that you can do human rights and equalities in practice. This is not the only way, but We think the panel principles really sum up a lot of the kind of principles of human rights and equalities really nicely. And these definitions, they're taken from the Scottish Human Rights Commission. They're used by other organisations around the world, including the UN, United Nations types of organisations. So that's just to say that, you know, it's not just us making these principles up. They're something that are used by lots of different human rights bodies and organisations across the world. And so panel, participation, accountability, non-discrimination, empowerment, and legality. They provide a structured method of applying a human rights and equalities kind of approach. There's something that can be used before, during, after moments of change, or as a way of just kind of reflecting to think about the way that your organisation is doing your work. And again, we do want to emphasize that, like, you don't need to be a human rights expert, you don't need to be a legal expert. That's why we think panel principles are quite nice, because most of us are going to be familiar with participation, what good participation is. We're going to understand that accountability is something that's important. And so we think that the panel principles are quite accessible way for folks across an organisation, across different teams, across different structures, of being able to look at human rights and equalities without necessarily having to get too in depth in terms of the different treaties, conventions, etc. And so that's why we're focusing on the panel principles. So we're going to start with, controversially, the last letter of panel, but this is just because legality is really the foundation of human rights and equality. Is probably where we should start in terms of thinking about not breaking the law. That's not to say that people watching this are going to be breaking the law, but it's just that when we're talking about human rights and equalities, it's easiest to start with what is actually expected of us in terms of a legal perspective. So that sets us out in terms of our ground rules and our baseline to work with when we're thinking about an issue, by first thinking about our legal obligations and duties. So that can be things like the Equality Act, that can be things like your PVGs, and other kind of legislation that might apply specifically to the work that you're doing, depending on what groups you're working with. And it's just really the idea that you have got a clear understanding of the legal protections that are in place around the specific area that you're working in, and you know, your staff are aware of that, and you've got really strong understanding and perhaps training of that. So you could reflect on whether you have a equality, diversity, inclusion policy, or even a human rights policy that puts your commitment to adhering to the Equality Act in writing and what that looks like in practice. Things like the public sector equality duty, and you know, if you're working with vulnerable groups, that's something that applies to you, making sure that you've got really strong processes in place to make sure that people that are working with those vulnerable groups know their responsibilities and know what processes that they should follow. So when we're talking about legality, it's really just making sure that you know what's expected of you, and you've also got that embedded in your organisation and your work in a way that's going to make sure that everyone who is involved in your organisation understands that and understands what they need to do. So that's not really the exciting part of panel, but it's just a really important place to start from. And then when we think about participation, this means that people should be involved in decisions that affect their rights and equalities. This can range from the really obvious, from, you know, direct changes to services, moving venues, shutting down services, for example, or starting up new services, and the impact that that can have on people that are accessing support from your organisation, or even just something less noticeable in terms of how reducing staff members from 5 to 2 might impact on the experience of volunteers. So there's lots of different things that that participation can cover, but it's really about that voice and how involved people can be in decisions that affect them. This is because people are best placed often to say what will help to fulfill their rights and help to remove barriers that are in place in front of them. And a really useful one to be thinking about for funding applications, because you should be able to demonstrate how you know that what you're applying for will be good for the group that your project is for, or the service that you're delivering. And as we saw earlier in terms of dominant identity, we aren't always aware of the experiences of others. We aren't always, even if we have the best intentions, sometimes it can be really difficult to understand the experiences and the barriers that are going to be in place in front of people if we aren't in that group. And so participation, getting people involved, and trying to make sure that decisions come from a place of experience, of lived experience, is really important. So in terms of participation, thinking about whether you have done some surveys, some workshops, focus groups with folks that are using your service or you expect to benefit from your service, making sure that lived experience is kind of built into your organisation in terms of whether that's your volunteers, your board members, or even your staff members, looking at and reflecting on feedback on your monitoring and evaluation from previous bits of work that you've done. All of that is really, really important to note, and also reflects that, level of participation from what you're doing. And so thinking about all of that and packaging that up, that is really useful information, and will reflect really well on your organisation's ability to include people in decisions that are impacting them. So that's participation. And then accountability. So this refers to how there should be monitoring of how people's rights and equalities are being affected, as well as remedies available when things go wrong. And it can be really tricky to measure how we do human rights and equalities, but it actually can just be as simple as making sure that you've got feedback forms that ask things about, whether or not they feel like accessibility has been addressed, whether they felt included, whether they felt like that there were any barriers that could stop them from participating in the activities that you were running, for example, and also increasing available channels of communication, as well as signposting to advocacy and support. So accountability is not about finger pointing, it's not about shaming, it's not necessarily about all the things that have went wrong, but actually it's about all the things that have been in place, all the things that have been thought about before, in order to make sure that it doesn't get to that point of things going wrong. And even then, if things do go wrong, making sure that you've got really strong processes so that you can understand what's happened and also fix it. So in terms of talking about accountability, things like having a really good complaints procedure that's actually maybe advertised on your website, or the second that people come into your organisation, then being able to understand that if something goes wrong, they can talk about it, they can tell someone about it, and that's not going to be held against them. So having really open channels of communication with folks that are coming into your organisation and accessing your services. An example from a colleague actually is that they used to deliver wellbeing services to people that were in temporary housing situations. And so going into that space, they actually had these little business cards that on one side had the details of their safeguarding officer, and then on the other side had details in terms of like a few points of what they should be able to expect in terms of behaviour from the folks that were coming into that space and delivering those services. And that was a really, really simple way for them to provide accountability, because immediately if the staff member that was delivering that session was the one causing that problem, they knew that there was someone else that wasn't in that room, that was external to that situation, that they could go to and ask for support or raise a complaint with. And that was quite an easy way for them to build accountability into that service. And so things like that, all of that counts as really great practice in terms of human rights and equality, because you're making sure that people have a way of raising an issue and also getting a solution to it if things are going wrong. So that's just more things that you can think about. And then the next letter of panel is non-discrimination. So this refers to the fact that all forms of discrimination must be prohibited, prevented, and eliminated. It also states that people who face the biggest barriers to realising their rights should be prioritised. Now, I won't dwell on this one too much, just because we did have a bit of discussion on that in terms of the protected characteristics and dominant identity. But really thinking about the fact that everyone should have equal access to their rights, and this can be because of a range of reasons, from language barriers, childcare needs, digital exclusion, and many more, and thinking about the ways in which you can do that in terms of mitigating those barriers. And the thing about non-discrimination is there's no blanket way of doing that, because everyone's community is going to be very different. Everyone's situation is going to be very different. So if you're in an area in which actually the biggest demographic is older people, you're going to have to think about digital exclusion. You're going to have to think about perhaps actually health conditions, long-term health conditions, disability a bit more than folks that are working in a population area that doesn't actually have that many older people, but instead is working with a lot of children and young people. So non-discrimination and thinking about the things that you can do to make sure that you can make your services as accessible as you can, that's going to be really specific to the folks that you work with. And that is also why things like participation comes into it, because it's really important to know your community, know what they need, and do things that are specific to them. So while it might be first instinct to pop down in terms of your answer things like, we don't discriminate, we abide by the Equality Act, that if that's not specific to your community, have you really thought about non-discrimination? So making sure that you make it clear that you know what demographics you're going to be interacting with, or what demographics you're trying to interact with, and the specific barriers and issues that they face. That's a really strong way of putting across the fact that your organisation is thinking about equality and non-discrimination in a meaningful way, and not just trying to do a wee tick boxing exercise. We have a whole set of resources on non-discrimination and addressing barriers that people may face to their rights, and we will include links to this in the video description as well. Now, the last one that we have is empowerment. And this is that everyone should understand their rights and equalities and be fully supported to take part in processes that affect them. So the biggest barrier probably to people being able to access their rights and be able to achieve equality and inclusion is actually sometimes not knowing that they have rights in the first place, not understanding that equalities is something that an organisation is thinking about. People can't really advocate fully for something that they don't know about. And so actually it's really important throughout all these processes to include knowledge building and empowerment, so that people are informed and able to also use that to then support others to advocate for it themselves. So, pardon me. In thinking about participation, if you are putting on focus groups, workshops, letting folks know that, you're not just doing this as a favor or like a nice thing to do, but actually it is about participation and you really valuing the voices of community members in all that you do, and that you really value that lived experience. Small things like having posters up detailing what someone's rights are when they're in your space, making kind of like working together agreements with any groups that you support. These are all really simple things that you can highlight to a funder to show that you think of the people that you work with as having rights, and you are trying to help them to understand and take control of these rights and be active participants in these situations. So it's not just about someone coming along again to your service because it's just a nice thing that you're putting on, but actually you're trying to help them to access social security. You're trying to help them get into a better situation when it comes to their health. All of these things are really minor changes that you can do in terms of language, in terms of the way that you present things, but can make a big difference in terms of someone's confidence or their ability to engage with your service or your organisation. And the thing is, these are all likely things that you're already doing, so it can just be a case of being able to pick out all of these things that you're doing across your projects, across your organisation, and packaging them up in a way that makes sense in terms of human rights and equalities. So that's empowerment, but just to come back to these panel principles. So these are really our how-to when it comes to human rights and equalities, and you might have resonated with some of the principles more so than others, but they all come together to form a really intentional, conscious approach, and you can use these as a way of demonstrating that you are doing human rights and equalities, again, without necessarily having to come back into the United Nations conventions or all these different pieces of law, because at the end of the day, human rights and equalities, they boil down to these 5 principles. If you're able to demonstrate that you have built participation into how you design your services, that you have got really strong accountability processes, that non-discrimination is something that you really value, and that you're empowering the people that come into your organisation, and at the bottom line of it, you're following the law with legality. You are a human rights and equalities organisation, and these are things that you will all be doing in some form or another. So you might have a bigger focus on participation just now, or you are really strong on accountability, but that doesn't mean that you're not doing any of these at all. So it's really taking a bit of time to think about your organization, what you do, and just framing it in a different way. And so got another wee slide here. Just to kind of sum up what we've said, when we're thinking about human rights and equalities, the what is the freedom principles: fairness, respect, dignity, equality, dignity, and autonomy. And in terms of the how that actually happens, you've got participation, accountability, non-discrimination, empowerment, and legality. And we just find this to be a useful way of talking about human rights and equalities because, like Alice had mentioned earlier, we are likely doing all of these things, and it's just about thinking about them in a slightly different way. So that is what we mean when we're talking about human rights and equalities, and I hope that you're starting to put pieces together and start thinking about how your organisation does things that kind of align with these principles. Now, I'm going to stop talking for just a moment, and I'm going to pass over to Alice to, again, get us even deeper into thinking about that in a practical sense and what that means for our organisations.
Thank you, Suki. So yeah, now that we've gone through those panel principles as a way of making connections between our everyday practice and human rights and equalities, I just wanted to go a bit deeper, like Suki said, and give a few more examples for you on different areas within your organization and within your everyday practice that you can incorporate human rights and equalities into. So first off, thinking about policies and procedures, it's really important to embed any good work you're doing into your policies and procedures. And that is so that it's not just one or a few people who are picking up these good practices and putting them into what they do and carrying the human rights and equalities approach forward within an organization. Policies and procedures allow that those good practices, that good knowledge that people have, to be put into the framework of what an organization does. So say if you've had someone who's been on all the human rights and equalities training courses, they've been actively pushing this work forward. If they leave the organization, if you have those policies and procedures in place and that approach reflected in your policies and procedures, then if they leave the organization, you're not starting from scratch again. It's not all gone. You have it really bedded in. And so throughout any change within the organization, changing priorities, that will always be there. So that is why it's really useful to embed human rights and equalities within those policies and procedures. So I'll give you an example of what that might look like for a few different areas. So for volunteering policies, you might want to think about whether volunteering roles are flexible based on the potential volunteers' needs. You may want to think about things like providing prepaid bus tickets so that volunteers aren't out of pocket. That really helps to address socioeconomic disadvantage and make sure that there isn't a hidden cost to volunteering that prevents people from being able to engage with and help your organization. Thinking about EDI policies, so equality, diversity, and inclusion policies. I mentioned earlier about not just referencing the Equality Act in the protected characteristics. Some EDI policies actually do just say, like, we're committed to preventing discrimination based on the Equality Act, or they just reference it in that way. And there's not really any talk of practical action in terms of what that looks like specifically for the organization within the policy. So you may want to think about expanding on a statement like that and thinking about specific barriers that staff, volunteers, or service users may have, and actually putting the actions you can take to address those within the policy so that it's something that is really meaningful for your organization, rather than have a copy paste template that kind of feels like it could apply to all organizations, but also no organizations because they aren't specific. And last example on policies and procedures, digital strategies. So how can you ensure that accessibility is at the forefront when you're using digital tools? So for example, do your social media and comms teams make sure to have accessible formats available? Do you know what it means to have good kind of alternative text on social media posts and how to make that as helpful as possible? There are small things that you may not have even thought about that can be really helpful in terms of using digital in an accessible way. So for example, if you're posting on social media, it's really trendy at the moment to kind of litter posts with emojis, so kind of as punctuation at the end of a sentence. What people may not realize is that each emoji kind of has a label or a name attached to it that you don't typically see, or you're not typically aware of if you're just if you don't have any kind of accessibility needs that change the way that you use social media. However, for people with screen readers, that label or that name is read out just like the normal text in the post is read out. So you might have a post where you say something like, are you thinking about climate change? And for someone using a screen reader, that actually comes across as, are you thinking about climate change, leaf, tree, wind? And so that's not very helpful for someone who is using a screen reader. So that's something you may not be aware of, that you may want to think about and pop into your digital strategy or incorporate into your digital strategy, so that you are making things as accessible as possible. And moving on now to language use. This is something that is really simple that you can easily demonstrate within your funding applications. That is a good way to show that you're really embedding human rights and equalities into what you do and the culture of your organization. And what I mean by language use is incorporating kind of the values and the ethos of human rights and equalities into how you talk about what you do and your work. So how do you describe your organization and what you do? Do you, for example, promote dignity and autonomy in older people? Or do you facilitate participation and empowerment of care experienced people in education? The things that you're doing as an organization likely are addressing people's rights in some way, and pulling that language out can be really helpful for you to be able to show that you are human rights focused, that you are addressing barriers to participation, that you are, hitting those marks when it comes to human rights and equalities just by doing what you do. So just having to think about that language and tweaking that a little bit can be really, really helpful for kind of demonstrating that you are a rights-based organization and that is part of what you do. And thinking about accessibility considerations, I know I've just touched on it a little bit in the policies and procedures, but this is something you should be really actively thinking about with all aspects of what you do. So you should be thinking about how you're making sure that everyone can access the work that you're doing without any barriers in place. This may be something that funding applications specifically ask about. So it's really important that you just say, if you have a risk assessment when you're planning an event or a service or a project, make sure that those accessibility points are built into that, so that you can show that forward thinking and that planning around accessibility. So an important part of this is about understanding who your project, your service, whatever it may be, is for, and the unique experiences that they may face. So for example, if you're hosting a community group for young mothers or living in the same area, have you thought about bus timetables and how those fit with, school runs? So are they actually going to be able to get to your event or your group in time? after doing the school run? Does it make sense? Are people going to be able to attend? And when you're thinking about the specific needs of the people that you are hoping to attract to these sessions, that you're hoping to support and work with, you'll find some really interesting barriers. You'll find some interesting things that you need to be thinking about and addressing with how you plan what you do. And that, I think, leads really neatly on to co-design and lived experience, because sometimes especially if you're not part of that group that you are looking to support or work with, you may not know what the barriers they face may be. So for example, if you're not someone who's ever had to access the benefit system, you may not know how that impacts on someone's ability to volunteer, for example, or just the difficulties with being able to access that system and how that affects someone. So co-design and lived experience is a good way to be able to understand what those needs or those barriers may be, and then to address them. If you are doing that in any way, again, it's really useful just to flag to funders when you're applying for a fund that you are doing that, because that will help them to know, like, okay, this is actually going to do what it says it's going to do. Like, you're putting the right things in place for that group, and you know what you're talking about. So it is a really useful thing to reference, to be doing, and to be talking about when you are doing it. And I won't go too much into how to do that, as I think we've covered that quite well with that participation section of panel that we touched on earlier. So those are just a few examples of what human rights and equalities might look like for you and for your organization, for what you do, and how you can talk about those a little bit in your funding application. But I'm now going to take things even further into thinking about funding applications. So we are going to have some reflection questions, and we're going to use those in order to prompt thinking about how we can put what we do, what we know about human rights and equalities, how we translate that into our work, into a funding application. So how can we simply sum up everything that we've talked about today into a short, simple answer that you can pop in funding applications? So I've got a few prompt questions for you. The first ones are about thinking about where your organization embeds human rights and equalities into your policies and your practices. You may wish to use the panel principles to answer a question like this. You can just pop them in as bullet points to give you a neat little structure to work from. I will say sometimes with panel, the one setback to that can be that sometimes the principles can feed into each other. So maybe it can feel a little bit repetitive. Say if your empowerment work feels very linked to your participation work, which they sometimes can do. But overall, it is really useful just to pop in to help give you that structure to what you're thinking about. But what you can do is just to think about what the practical steps you are taking are in order to make sure that you're really representative of the organization you're looking to support, that you're as accessible as is reasonable and possible, and that you're inclusive, especially thinking about all of those things when it comes to people who have additional support needs or who face barriers based on the protected characteristics that they hold. So, for example, do you try to use accessible venues when possible? Do you make adjustments to help different communities to engage with you in the work that you do? Do you know what your equalities policy says and feel like it reflects your everyday practice? That's a big one, because I think oftentimes when asked about human rights and equalities in funding applications, organizations can be tempted to just say, we have an equality, diversity, and inclusion policy, full stop. And that's all they say, but I'm not sure that really is helpful for anyone reading that application to know actually what are you doing in practice? What does that mean for your organization? So actually showing like how those policies are reflected in everyday practice is a really simple thing you can pop down, just to show that you really are living that human rights and equalities first approach. And I think there's so many kind of simple examples that organizations will be doing every day that you can just pop in there, you know, without having to change too much of what you do, but just, you know, reframing what you do to fit into what those questions are looking for. And with that, I'm going to actually move on to another reflection question. So what I would encourage you to do after watching this webinar is to pause and actually make notes on these questions and have a little, like, do the thinking about how you would answer these questions, how prepared you feel to answer them, and maybe have a look at more free resources to give you like extra kind of information to refer to as you're answering them. But definitely give it a pause, have a go at these yourself. But with that, I'll move on to the next question, which is reflecting upon what simple steps you or your organization could take to strengthen your ability to answer human rights and equalities questions. So I just mentioned a second ago that there's lots of small things that you're already doing that you can kind of reframe in order to talk about in like a human rights and equalities way, or to reframe in your mind to say, actually, yeah, this is helping people with their participation, with, you know, with helping them to access something, or so that they know what their rights are. There's that stuff you're already doing that will fit into that. But there's also simple steps that your organization could take to strengthen your approach and strengthen what you do in terms of human rights and equalities. So maybe as you were listening to Suki talk through the panel principles, you noticed that maybe there were some gaps in your practice, that maybe, yeah, there's some things that really resonate and that you feel like, oh yeah, we do that, and that really feels like accountability. But maybe there were some gaps where you felt, oh, I'm not sure we're actually very confident on this one. Have a think about those, reflect on those, and think of some small steps you could take, some simple steps you could take in order to address those and to really strengthen your position in that regard. That doesn't have to be really big. Just like the little business cards example that Suki mentioned earlier, that's such an easy small step that can make quite a big difference. So yeah, have a think about what those gaps are. And also, you know, keep it positive, like think about those strengths that you already have that you could really highlight in a funding application, but also expand upon. And you can also say in a funding application that, yeah, we already do this and we'd like to do more of it, but we need more money to be able to do that, or maybe it's not achievable for you at this time, but it's something you'd like to do in the future. That is all stuff that you're really able to be transparent about and that you can communicate through funding applications. So as I said, those questions, I just recommend you pause on this slide if you want, or where the previous slide was on the screen, and actually have a go at answering these questions, and hopefully that can set out a really good plan for you so that next time you are looking at a funding application and you say, oh God, they're asking about human rights and equalities and I don't feel like I know about that, you have a plan in place already, and you can really simply translate that plan that you've written out into an answer that feels like it's really true to your organization and what you do. So now that we've gone through those reflection questions, I'm going to move on to a slightly different topic, and that is climate change and climate action. The reason I'm going to do that is because, you know, part of why we're doing this session today is about people having that feeling when they look at a funding application and ask about human rights equalities, and they go, oh no, like, I don't feel confident about this. How am I going to answer this question? Are we going to have to do loads of stuff that we don't know about, or we're not doing at the moment? And we wanted to help ease that and help you feel confident with answering those questions. But equally, we recognize that funders are increasingly asking questions about climate change and climate action as well. So whilst we're talking about this, we just wanted to also address issues around climate change so that you can also feel confident when answering those questions in funding applications as well. So I'm going to quickly just share a little bit about how climate change is relevant to Scottish communities, because that may not be initially clear for everyone. So I just want to share a few of the impacts of climate change in Scotland. So there's an increase in unpredictable and extreme weather like flooding. So if you remember in 2021, in Glasgow, there was a rainstorm that ended up with Drumchapel having flooding of about 4 feet of water. And it's no coincidence that Drumchapel is in one of the 5% most deprived areas in Scotland. Unfortunately, these things do tend to have a disproportionate impact on people who are already disadvantaged in some way, in those kind of ways we tend to think about with human rights equalities, think about human rights as well. That flooding affected things like people's right to housing, with homes sustaining really heavy damage, right to water and sanitation, and right to an adequate standard of living. Other impacts, poorer well-being outcomes. So pollution has a really negative effect on people who have asthma, for example, and economic impact. So farming may be less successful due to that unpredictable and extreme weather, and that poor yield from that can lead to higher food prices, extreme weather events leading to damage that there needs to be, that's costs that people need to replace items and make repairs to buildings. And so again, for people who are hardest up already, these costs are going to have a really big impact. So if you're an organization that is already doing things like distributing food via food banks, supporting to have like warm, safe spaces for people in the local communities to go to during winter, for example, having like outdoor green spaces for your local community. These are things that will feel quite relevant to you and to what you do every day. So you might want to make the connections there within any funding applications that you do if they're asking about how climate change feeds in. And I'm going to move over now to some general points about what any organization can do to address climate change. So you could track your carbon footprint as an organization. So you have a policy in place where you actually are looking at what your carbon footprint is and trying to reduce that through simple changes in how you operate and how you do things. You can also evaluate your recycling habits. So, this is something you may already be recycling, but when you hear about like, how do you address climate action, and you hear that in a funding application, it may sound a bit like big and intimidating, when actually just saying things like saying things like, oh, you make sure that you recycle properly, that you minimize food waste, for example, that is answering that question, that is addressing that. So yeah, thinking about your recycling habits is something that you can bring in. You can also prioritize local suppliers and sustainable sourcing. So think about where the products that you use, the supplies that you use every day come from, and that will help to minimize that carbon footprint if you can keep things local when possible and to source things in a sustainable way. And you can also think about promoting active travel. So how do people get to your organization if you have a physical building? If you can encourage people to take public transport rather than using a car, or if they can cycle or walk into the organization to the venue, that's fantastic. And again, is a simple step that can help to address climate change and contribute to climate action. And so that is all just for some simple tips on how you can answer those kind of funding questions around climate change. It's it's simple. It's not too much information, hopefully. But if you do want more information on this, if you want to delve a bit deeper into this topic, we do have 2 resources on climate change and the right to a healthy environment and what that all means. So I do recommend those to you, and also to access your local climate hubs in order to get a bit more information on that. But hopefully that is enough just to get you feeling a bit more confident about being able to answer those questions. So that's all from me, and I'll just hand over to Suki, who's going to help us to wrap up and to start reflecting on everything that we've learned during this session.
Thank you, Alice. So I'm just going to really try and summarize what we've spoken about over the last hour, hour and a bit, and kind of those key points. And I know we've talked about a lot of stuff. We're probably giving you quite a bit of information, but if you don't take anything away, hopefully these kind of 5 points are really what's sticking in your head. In terms of it's not about talking about human rights and equalities and climate action in some way that's bigger than your organization or higher than that. It's actually about what you're doing. So really lean on those examples and your experiences that you have. It's really much more useful and much clearer to funders if you're actually able to give proper examples and experiences of things that you've implemented that have made a difference, or things that you've actually got in place. So rather than saying you really value equality, diversity, and inclusion, talking about the fact that, you know, you have got a group that is specifically made for wheelchair users, and that they, you know, come into your building once a week and do whatever activity. Like something like that is much more clear in terms of demonstrating all of this in practice than just saying vaguely that, you know, you care about equality, diversity and inclusion, and, you know, it's something that you really value as an organization. Actually being able to demonstrate that is much more valuable to a funder to be able to see and hold as a concrete example. Talk about the obvious stuff. So some of this work might be really evident to you. It might be really clear that, you know, when you say that you provide a translation service or interpreter service to the folks that ask for it, to you that can be really obvious in terms of like, yeah, we have a really big Farsi speaking community, or we engage with a lot of refugees and asylum seekers, and so that's why we have a translation service or interpretation service. That might be obvious to you, but a funder looking at that is not immediately going to know that that's why you have that translation and interpretation service. So trying to make the really obvious links between what you do, why you do it, and the reasons that you, how you've came to that reasoning. So, you know, again, having hearing loops in your space, because you know that you engage with a lot of people in the older community who are more likely to be deaf or hard of hearing, things like that. Just making the connection again between the things that you're doing, why you're doing them, and the reasons that have got you to that space. Talking about that really obvious stuff, because again, with human rights and equalities, you're in the third sector. You are going to be doing human rights and equalities because you're going to be supporting people from likely marginalized groups of some form to access some sort of service, some sort of community. So you're already doing the work. It's just really saying it out loud. And again, it's not about reinventing the wheel. It is all of these things that are likely, again, already happening, and making sure that you're being really clear in evidencing that. As well as that, you can also reflect on what you don't do and what you could do. It's not going to be possible to do absolutely everything. So you can also, when you're talking about your plans for the organization, think about what you would be able to do if you had some more resources, if you had some more capacity, because then that demonstrates that, again, you have reflected on what needs and what barriers exist for the folks that are trying to access your services, or the folks that you're trying to support, that you know that, but you maybe just don't have the capacity or the resources to be able to do that. And again, that actually can be part of making the case to the funder that this funding is required, because if you had X, Y, or Z amount of funds, you would be able to provide that support to this community. These are all things that are actually really valuable for funders to know. And again, it's really good evidence that you have considered that and that you know what you're talking about, basically. And finally, remember to consider it's about what is reasonable for your work and organisation. Again, we've spoken about a lot of stuff, and we don't want to, I guess, freak anyone out in terms of making you think that you need to be going so far as to, you know, be a UN accredited body. That is absolutely not the case. It's about what is reasonable for you, for your work, and for your organisation. If you are a tiny organisation with a staff of 2 people or 3 people, it's not expected that you've got a fleet of translators for 56 languages on hand at any moment ready to go. That's not reasonable for the size of your organisation and the scope of what you do. So if you don't have a huge amount of stuff in terms of being able to list X, Y, and Z stuff that you do, if that's reflective of the size of your organisation, the scale of your organisation, say that, you know, note that you might not have the capacity to do these things, but you have considered that it is reasonable for you to provide this, that this meets this need for the community, etc., etc. Being really frank and open in these answers is often much more useful to a funder than someone kind of bluffing and trying to be more than they actually are, because you want to be able to show that you know, again, you know your stuff, you know your community, you know the people that you're supporting, and that is what is necessary for these questions, rather than trying to go so far and above that you're far and away from actually what is reflective of your community and the needs in that in those situations. And really, that is all to say that you have all the answers already. Again, it might just be a case of tweaking your language a little bit, thinking about how to frame things in a certain way, and hopefully things like the panel principles will be helpful to that. So we just hope that this has been useful in terms of reassuring you that it's not something that's completely outside of your scope as an organisation. Again, as third sector organisations, you are doing equalities and human rights work likely in some context. And it's just about making sure that you've got the right framing and the ways of knowing how to put that into an application that will put that across to a funder. So that's really us. We hope that that has been useful for you in terms of bringing you a bit more up to speed in terms of human rights and equalities and how that is reflected in your work and the things that you do every day. You can find lots more information about human rights and equalities in all sorts of different contexts on our website. That is THRE.org.uk. We have lots of information about policies and procedures, like I said, things about the Equality Act, and we'll link all of that down in the video description. If you have any further questions or things that you'd like to contact us about, you can drop us an email at thre@gcvs.org.uk, where we can have further conversations about any of this stuff if you'd like to. But otherwise, that's us. Thank you so much for watching this webinar. We hope it was of value to you, and we wish you all the best of luck with your funding applications. Thank you very much.